she slapped him across the face and, on his own plane, the sound cracked through the cabin like a gunshot. Clean. Flat. Final. It bounced off $65 million worth of walnut panels and cream leather, and hung in the recycled air like smoke. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, didn't move a single inch. He just reached slowly into his hoodie pocket, 2 fingers, deliberate, unhurried, and pulled out his phone. The screen was already on. The recording had been running for 11 minutes and 23 seconds. He set it face up on the armrest. Let her see it. Let her hear the microphone pulsing. And then he looked at her with the particular calm of a man who has been waiting very long time for exactly this moment. "Everything you've said," he said quietly. "Everything you've done, the slap, the lie you're about to tell security." He paused. "It's all right here." She had boarded his aircraft that morning and decided, before he opened his mouth, before he said a single word, that he didn't belong there. She was about to find out exactly who he was. She slapped him across the face, on his own plane, and she still thought she was going to win. Let's go back to where this started. Baltimore, 1987. A Tuesday morning in October, cold enough to see your breath, not cold enough to matter. Darnell Okafor was 15 years old and standing in a corner store on Presbury Street with a bottle of water and a loaf of bread. That was it, $1.47. He had exact change in his palm because his mother always told him to have exact change. Less time at the register. Less reason for anyone to look twice. He set the items on the counter. The man behind the register, 50s, gray at the temples, reading glasses, pushed up on his forehead, looked at Darnell. Not at the water, not at the bread, at Darnell. Then he looked toward the back of the store and gave a small nod. A security guard appeared. Big man, dark uniform. He walked over and stood 2 feet to Darnell's left and just. Stood there. Nobody said anything. The cashier rang up the items without a word. Darnell put his $1.47 on the counter. Took his bag. Walked out. He didn't run. Running would have meant something. He walked. Steady. Even. Like his heartbeat wasn't doing what it was doing.
His mother's on the sidewalk.
She saw his face immediately. That night, after dinner, she sat across from him at the kitchen table and folded her hands the way she always folded them when she was about to say something she had already decided on. You didn't do anything wrong. He already knew that. But sometimes, she said, staying quiet is the smartest thing a person can do. He looked at his mother, Eleanor Okafor, eyes that missed nothing. Hands that had built everything they had from double shifts and sheer refusal to quit. He believed her, so he did what she said. For the next 37 years, Darnell Okafor stayed quiet. Here is what 37 years of quiet looks like. It looks like a scholarship to Howard University that he earned with grades so clean they couldn't be argued with. It looks like a one-room logistics office in Southeast D.C. with a second-hand desk and a business plan written on notebook paper. It looks like 25 years of building, bidding it, losing contracts and coming back, hiring the first employee, then the 10th, then the 100th. It looks like Pinnacle Bridge Group, $4.7 billion, aerospace infrastructure, commercial logistics, real estate holdings across 13 states. A company that moved things, cargo, contracts, capital, with the kind of quiet efficiency that made other companies nervous. Darnell didn't appear on magazine covers. He didn't do keynote speeches at conferences where men in expensive suits patted each other on the back. He didn't have a publicist or a social media presence or a table at the kind of restaurants where people went specifically to be seen. He just built, quietly, constantly, the way his mother taught him, and somewhere along the way, quiet became his armor. The morning of the incident, he was out of bed before 5. That was normal. Darnell had been waking before 5 since his 30s. Something about the early dark felt honest, like the world hadn't decided yet who it was going to be that day. Like he had a few minutes before everything started requiring things from him. He made coffee. Dark, no sugar. He stood at the kitchen window of his home in Montclair, New Jersey, and watched the tree in the backyard do nothing in particular. and he drank his coffee, and he didn't think about anything important. Edz was still asleep upstairs. He didn't wake her. She had a showing at 9, and she'd been up late reviewing contracts. His wife ran her own business, a luxury home staging and design firm that had become, over 15 years, one of the most respected in the Northeast. Sharp in a way people underestimated, warm in a way people didn't expect. She had been the first person in 2 decades to tell Darnell Okafor something he didn't want to hear, and say it without flinching. He'd married her for a lot of reasons. That was one of them. He left a note on the counter. 3 words. Back Sunday night. She would know everything else without being told. Now. The hoodie. People must see assumptions about the hoodie. His assistant had made assumptions. His board members had made assumptions. A journalist once had written a paragraph about Darnell's studied casualness as if it were some kind of calculated brand strategy. It wasn't. The truth was simpler and older and more painful than any journalist would have found interesting. 2014, Chicago. A hotel near the river, the kind with marble floors and a chandelier in the lobby, and staff who wore earpieces and called you sir before you finished walking through the door. Darnell was 42 years old. He had just closed a $40 million contract with a regional freight company, and he was celebrating alone because that was how he celebrated things. Quietly, with a decent meal and a room with a view. He walked into that hotel in a charcoal suit, custom fitted. He'd bought it in New York 2 months earlier from a tailor who'd been making suits for people like him for 30 years. He walked up to the check-in desk. The woman behind the counter looked at him. Then her eyes moved past him to a white man who had come through the door maybe 10 seconds after Darnell. She smiled at that man. She said, "Welcome back. We have your room ready." She said it like Darnell wasn't standing right there. He waited. She came back to him, professional, efficient, a little cooler than she'd been a moment before, though she would never have described it that way. She processed his reservation. She gave him his key card. He went upstairs. He ordered room service, ate alone, sat by the window with a glass of bourbon and watched the river and told himself it was fine. It was nothing. It happened all the time. You stayed quiet. You moved on. But here is what he did not know until much later. He did not know about the man with the briefcase who walked into that same hotel 3 months after him. A developer from Atlanta, new money, confident. He did not know that man had complained, loudly, specifically, with the manager's full attention, about being overlooked at check-in. He did not know that man had a video on his phone. Just habit. He did not know that the hotel issued a formal apology, changed their training protocol, did something that looked like accountability. Darnell found out by accident. A mutual acquaintance mentioned it at a dinner. Passed it off as a story. Isn't that something? Darnell sat very still and said yes. Can you believe it? And afterward, driving home, he thought, I was there first. I had the same experience. Then I said nothing. So nothing changed. After that, he started carrying his phone differently. Not obsessively, not like a man expecting trouble, but like a man who had learned, slowly, expensively, in ways that cost him things he never talked about. That his word alone was not going to be enough. His word had never been enough. So he'd tried suits. He'd tried watches. He'd tried looking exactly like what he was. A man who had built something real and belonged everywhere he set foot. And people still looked at him like that. So at some point, he stopped dressing for their assumptions and started dressing for information. Because here is what the hoodie told him. When he walked into a room in a hoodie and jeans, and someone greeted him warmly, someone asked how they could help, someone's treated him like a person with every right to be wherever he was. He knew something about that person. He knew they were seeing him. Not his net worth, not his suit. Him. And when someone looked at him sideways. When someone's posture shifted. When someone's voice got careful in that particular way. He knew something about that person, too. The hoodie was not a statement. It was a test. And on the morning of the incident, he was wearing a plain black one. Dark jeans, sneakers he'd had for 4 years, a leather weekender bag over one shoulder, a tablet under his arm. He drove himself to the airport. He always drove himself. Teterboro Airport in New Jersey sits about 12 miles outside of Manhattan. Not the kind of place regular travelers pass through. No departure boards, no long security lines, no overpriced sandwiches in cellophane wrap. Just a private terminal. Clean, quiet. The kind of quiet that has money in it. Darnell knew the woman at the front desk. Linda. She had checked him through this terminal more times than either of them could count. She smiled when she saw him, called him by name, waved him through. He walked out onto the tarmac. His aircraft was waiting, a Gulfstream G700. Tail number G-Apex. $65 million of engineering precision, registered under Pinnacle Bridge Group, managed by Atlas Wing Aviation. The interior was cream leather and dark walnut, and a faint smell of cedar from the diffuser in the galley. 4 oversized seats in the main cabin, a conference table with embedded screens, a private suite in the rear behind frosted glass for the overnight trips. He climbed the air stairs. He took his seat, second row, left side, window. Always the same seat. He had his reasons. He set his bag on the seat beside him, pulled out his tablet, opened the acquisition file he'd been reviewing since 6 in the morning. He was heading to Charleston, South Carolina. A regional logistics company he'd been watching for 2 years had finally signaled they were open to an offer. The kind of deal that took months to position and hours to close. He was ready. He put his headphones on. He did not notice when the crew changed. Diana Marsh had been flying private for 13 years. She knew this world. She knew how it worked. Which clients wanted conversation and which ones wanted silence. Which chairs you touched and which ones you didn't. She was good at her job. Ask her, and she'd tell you that directly, without apology. She'd built a reputation at Atlas Wing as someone who kept the cabin running with the precision of a Swiss watch. No drama, high standards. Ask her colleagues, though, and they'd tell you something different. Not loudly, not on the record. In break rooms, in crew vans between terminals, in the tired, sideways conversations that happen at the end of long days when people finally stop performing and just talk. They'd tell you about a pattern. It wasn't always obvious. It wasn't always dramatic. It was quieter than that. Colder. A greeting that arrived 2 beats too late. A look that lasted 3 seconds too long. A tone that shifted depending on who was asking. 3 passengers had filed formal complaints against Diana Marsh in the last 3 years. 3 separate incidents. 3 separate people who had taken the time and the energy to put what happened to them in writing. All 3 were black. All 3 complaints landed on the desk of Paul Stanton, Human Resources, mid-level manager, 12 years at the company. The kind of man who organized his inbox by color and prided himself on keeping his numbers clean. Paul reviewed the first complaint and found it insufficient. He reviewed the second and found it insufficient. He reviewed the third the same way. What Paul never mentioned in any of those reviews was that Diana had once done something for him. 8 years earlier, Paul had handled a passenger dispute badly. Misread the situation, made the wrong call, said something on record that could have cost him. Diana had been there. She'd backed him up. Quietly, effectively. The kind of help you don't put in an email. Paul had never forgotten. He'd never said so directly. But those 3 complaint files sat closed in a drawer, and Diana Marsh had never faced a single sock consequence, and some debts get paid in ways that are very hard to point to later. Diana was not supposed to be on this flight. Her regular route had been grounded that morning. Maintenance issue. She got to Summit at 6:15 a.m., 45 minutes before the charter was scheduled to depart. She drove to Teterboro fast, parked fast, got through the terminal fast. She did not pull up the flight manifest. She did not check the client profile. She didn't have time, she told herself. She'd been doing this for 13 years. She knew how to read a cabin. She boarded the aircraft. She walked through the forward galley. Said something quick, and professional to Sophie Reeves, the junior attendant, who was already checking supplies at 6:50 in the morning. Diana walked into the main cabin, and she stopped. There was a man in the owner's suite. Tall, even-seated, she could tell. Broad across the shoulders, black, wearing a hoodie and dark jeans and sneakers, headphones around his neck. A bag on the seat beside him, looking at a tablet like he owned the place. Diana stood very still for 1 second, and in that second, 1 single second, something happened in her that she would never fully examine. Never describe accurately, not to a lawyer, not to a judge, not to anyone. Because to describe it accurately would have required a kind of honesty she was not capable of. She saw what she saw, and she decided what it meant. She did not check the system. She walked down the aisle. Darnell heard the heels before he looked up. Click, click, click. Not the sound of someone arriving. The sound of someone advancing. He pulled his headphones down to his neck and looked up from his tablet. A woman standing in front of him. Uniform pressed, hair pulled back tight, hands already moving to cross over her chest. I'm going to need to see your boarding confirmation. Not hello, not good morning. Not any of the things that 13 years of hospitality training should have made automatic. Just that. Sharp. Already certain. Darnell looked at her for one moment. He recognized the tone, the posture, the particular professional coldness doing the work of something much less professional. He didn't react to it. He opened the Atlas Wing app on his phone and held the screen toward her. The charter confirmation, his name, the tail number, the date, everything. Diana glanced at it. 2 seconds, maybe. This just shows a booking. It doesn't confirm your seating assignment. This section reserved. Reserved, that word. Darnell put his phone down. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Diana's jaw moved. Look, I don't know what happened at the desk, but this is the owner's suite. It's designated for the principal client. She paused. The next words came wrapped in patience that had no warmth in it at all. There are seats in the rear cabin that would be more appropriate. These mix-ups happen. More appropriate. He put his headphones back on. He went back to his tablet. And that simple, quiet refusal to engage did something to Diana Marsh that pure argument never could have. She stood there. He wasn't looking at her. He wasn't defending himself. He wasn't explaining himself. He was just not moving. Her nostrils flared. She walked to his leather weekender bag on the seat beside him, picked it up with both hands. Let me help you relocate. She started walking toward the rear of the aircraft. Darnell stood up. When he rose from that seat, something shifted in the air of the cabin. He was 6'2". He hadn't moved fast. He hadn't raised his voice. He just stood, and space rearranged itself around him. Put my bag down. 3 words. Even. Clear. The kind of authority that doesn't need volume. Diana stopped mid-step. Turned around. For just a moment, 1 fraction of a second, something crossed her face. Surprise. Maybe even something that could have become recognition if she'd let it. She didn't let it. She set the bag down. Not gently. She dropped it. It hit the floor with a sound that bounced off the walnut walls. Then she leaned in slightly, lowered her voice. You don't want to make this difficult. She turned and walked back toward the galley and said, loud enough for the whole cabin. This is exactly what happens when people don't read the instructions. Sophie Reeves was 26 years old and 7 months into a job she had worked very hard to get. She was standing in the galley doorway with a tray of water glasses in both hands. She had been staying there for the last 3 minutes. She had watched all of it. She wanted to say something. Her mouth had opened twice. Nothing came out. But Soph started at Atlas Wing in April. Before that, she had spent 3 years on regional commercial flights out of Charlotte, waiting for an opening in private aviation that would let her build towards something real. She had gotten this job because she was good. She had not given the right answer yet. She thought about Rachel Simmons. 6 months ago. A junior attendant who had offered a mild, completely reasonable suggestion during a crew briefing about the positioning of beverages. And within 3 weeks, she was processing cargo transfers at a regional hub in Ohio. Diana had not been directly involved, not officially. But everyone knew. Sophie thought about Rachel. She thought about the tray in her hands. She thought about her lease and her car payment and the loan she was still paying down from her training certification. She stood in the galley doorway, and she said nothing. For now, Diana came back. That was the thing. She came back. Darnell had sat down again, headphones on, tablet open. He was reviewing a paragraph about depreciation schedule, Charleston acquisition file, and trying to stay focused on the numbers. He heard her heels. Click, click, click. She stopped in front of him again. Face flushed, voice louder than the situation called for. Loud enough to reach the cockpit if the door hadn't been sealed for pre-flight. I'm going to say this once more. You either show me an ID that confirms your authorization for this section, or I will contact ground security and have you removed from this aircraft. She let that sit for one breath. Your choice. Darnell removed his headphones, slowly, folded them, laid them on the armrest. I'd like to speak to your captain. Diana blinked. A theatrical pause. You don't get to make requests. You're a passenger. I am the senior crew member on this aircraft. I determine seating compliance. She pointed toward the rear of the plane. Darnell looked at her, just looked at her, and said quietly enough that she had to hold very still to hear it. I'm not going anywhere. Do what you need to do. Something broke in Diana Marsh. Later, she would not be able to explain it clearly. Later, sitting in a lawyer's office, trying to reconstruct the sequence, she would use words like provoked and threatened and escalation. She would say she had felt unsafe. What actually broke was simpler and uglier than any of that. He wouldn't submit. That was it. A black man in a hoodie in the most expensive seat on her aircraft, looking at her with those calm, steady eyes, and he would not. Submit. Her hand shot out toward his headphones on the armrest. She was going to take them. She didn't think it through. She was going to take them the way you take a toy from a child who is refusing to listen, because she had already decided, without deciding, without the word ever forming consciously, that that was the category he belonged in. Darnell pulled back. Instinct, just instinct. His arm moved away from her hand, and in moving away, his hand grazed the side of her forearm. Barely. The lightest possible contact. The kind that happens when someone invades your space and your body spawns before your brain does. Diana recoiled like she'd touched a live wire. She took a full step backward, eyes wide, mouth open, and then she swung. Open palm, full force, right side of his face. The sound was a crack, hard and flat and final. It bounced off the walnut walls. It filled the cabin, and then the cabin went completely silent. In the galley, Sophie Reeves dropped a water glass. It hit the floor and shattered. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her eyes did not look away from the cabin. Darnell's head had turned from the force of it. A red mark was already rising on his left cheek. He sat completely still.
5 seconds, 6.
6. The kind of stillness that could have been patience, or could have been a man making a very careful decision about what came next. Diana was breathing hard, her hand still raised, her chest heaving. Don't you ever put your hands on me? Her voice shaking. Not with fear, with the conviction of someone who has already written the story in her own head. I felt what you did. I have every right to defend myself. She smoothed her uniform, straightened her postureskun, and her voice shifted, instantly, completely, into something controlled and measured and carefully constructed. I'm contacting security. You're being removed. And when they arrive, I'm going to tell them exactly what you did. Darnell did not speak. He raised his hand. 2 fingers, moving with the kind of deliberate slowness that made Diana take another step back. He reached into his hoodie pocket, pulled out his phone. The screen was on. The recording app was running. The timer read 11 minutes and 23 seconds. He set the phone face up on the armrest. The microphone icon pulsed on the screen. He looked at Diana and said, in a voice above the cabin ventilation, everything you've said, everything you've done, the slap, the threat. What you're about to tell them. It's all right here. Diana looked at the phone. She looked at the timer. 11 minutes, 23 seconds, 24, 25. Something went cold in her face. Not the anger, that didn't leave. But something else arrived underneath it. Something she hadn't felt once during this entire confrontation. Doubt. Just the edge of it. Darnell leaned back in his seat, folded his hands, said just as quietly, "I'd still like to speak to your captain." Diana pressed the intercom button in the galley with a steady hand. Her voice, when it came out, was transformed. Softer. Just slightly unsteady. The specific register of a woman who has been through something and is trying to hold herself together. "Ground ops, this is Senior Attendant Marsh on GAPEX. I need security at the aircraft. We have an unruly passenger in the user's suite refusing to comply with crew instructions." A pause. Then quieter, like a confidence. He became physically aggressive. He grabbed my arm. "I feel unsafe." She released the button. Turned back toward the cabin. Her face had reset completely. Sophie Reeves, still standing in the galley doorway, watched her do it. And Sophie understood, in the way that young people sometimes understand things they've never been told, that what she had just witnessed was not a person telling the truth. She looked at the man in seat 2. Darnell Okafor was sitting exactly where he had been sitting when Diana first walked onto the aircraft. Tablet on his lap, phone on the armrest. Face turned slightly toward the window. The mark on his cheek still red. He looked, Sophie thought, like a man who had been here before. Not on this plane, not in this specific seat, but here, in this kind of moment. The kind where someone had made a decision about him and before he'd done a single thing, and he was essence now simply waiting for the world to catch up to the truth. She looked at the broken glass on the galley floor. She thought about Rachel Sims in Ohio. She thought about the family from 6 months earlier. Mother, father, 2 kids, business class tickets. Diana's voice dropping to that register. She set down the tray. She was done standing in doorways. 2 security officers appeared at the top of the air stairs 4 minutes later. The older one wore a name tag that read Devereaux, Frank Devereaux, 19 years at Teterboro. He had seen enough situations to have learned one thing above everything else. Wait for the facts. He walked down the aisle toward the seated man, calmly. "Sir, I'm Officer Devereaux with Teterboro Ground Security. May I see some identification?" Darnell reached into his back pocket. No hesitation. He handed over his driver's license and waited. Devereaux looked at the name, looked at the man, looked at the name again. He stepped away, turned his back to the cabin, keyed his radio low. "Ground ops, this is Devereaux. Need a client verification on tail number GAPEX. Confirm the registered charter principal for today's departure." Silence. 10 seconds. Then the radio crackled. "Devereaux confirmed. GAPEX is registered to Pinnacle Bridge Group. Today's sole charter client is Darnell Okafor, CEO and registered owner of the holding company. He is the principal on file." Devereaux lowered the radio, stood very still for it a moment, then he turned. Not toward Darnell, toward Diana. The look on his face was not theatrical. It was the specific expression of a man who has just understood something and is deciding what to do with it. He walked past Diana without speaking. Stopped in front of Darnell. "Mr. Okafor, I sincerely apologize for the disruption. Is there anything you need from us?" Darnell looked at him. A long, steady look. "I need her off my plane." Diana heard those 5 words and something happened to her face that she couldn't control. The color left it, completely, like a curtain being drawn. Her lips moved. No sound. Then in a voice that cracked down the middle, "Wait. He can't be." She stopped herself, looked at Darnell. "Look at him. There's no way he—" She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Every person in that cab heard the rest of the sentence in the silence that followed. And that silence, heavy, irreversible, said everything Diana couldn't. Sophie stepped out of the galley. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. She looked directly at Officer Devereaux and spoke clearly without asking permission. "I need to tell you what actually happened." Diana's head snapped toward her. "Sophie, don't." Sophie kept her eyes on Devereaux. "I saw the entire interaction from the galley. Mr. Okafor was seated when Ms. Marsh approached him. He showed her his booking confirmation. She dismissed it. She took his bag without permission and attempted to move it to the rear. When he stood and asked her to stop, she dropped the bag on the floor. She came back a second time and demanded he move. He asked to speak to the captain. She reached for his personal belongings. He pulled back. That's all he did. He pulled back. She struck him, full force, across the face. Then she told him she was going to report him for assault. The cabin ventilation hummed, nothing else. Diana took one step toward her. You have been here 7 months. 7 months. You don't understand how any of this works. When this is done, I will make sure you never. Mrs. Marsh. Devereaux's voice cut through the cabin like a door closing. Stop talking. Diana stopped. At that same moment, the cockpit door opened. Captain Hollings stepped into the cabin, still wearing his headset around his neck. Face closed. Tight. He had been monitoring the security channel for the last 3 minutes. He looked at Devereaux, at Darnell, at Diana. He needed about 30 seconds. Then, he turned to Diana and said, in the tone of a man who has made decisions like this before and does not enjoy them, Miss Marsh, you are relieved of duty, effective immediately. Collect your personal belongings. You have 60 seconds to deplane. Captain, if you just... That was not a request. Diana stood there for 5 of those 60 seconds. Her eyes moved around the cabin, to Devereaux, to Sophie, to the younger officer who hadn't said a single word and was staring at her with his mouth slightly open. Finally, she looked at Darnell. Darnell did not look at her. He was already back on his tablet, already past her, already somewhere she was not. Diana grabbed her bag from the galley. Her heels on the cabin floor had a different sound now. Not a march, a retreat. At the top of the air stairs, she turned back, maybe to say something, maybe because some part of her still believed this was recoverable. The cabin door swung shut. The last thing she saw was the back of Darnell Okafor's head, still, calm, unmoved. The Gulf Stream lifted off at 7:14 a.m., smooth, quiet. It climbed through a thin layer of low cloud and broke into open sky. Sophie brought coffee to seat 2 without being asked. Her hands had stopped shaking. Her voice, when she spoke, was small. Mr. Okafor, I'm sorry for all of it. Darnell looked up. For the first time that morning, something in his face changed. Not a smile, something gentler than that. He took the coffee. Thank you, Sophie. A beat. What you did back there took real courage. She nodded, went back to the galley before her eyes could do what they wanted to do. Darnell set the coffee down, looked out the window. Below, the city was still waking up. Cars on highways, neighborhoods coming into light. An ordinary Tuesday morning for most people. The kind of morning where nothing particular happens and nobody gets tested, and you go home at the end of the day without having made any hard choices. He picked up his personal phone, not his business line, not Wendell Price. His personal phone with the contacts he'd had for decades, the numbers he called when things were real. He scrolled to one name, Eleanor Okafor, 79 years old. Room 14B at Meadowbrook Care Center in Baltimore. She still had her sharpness mostly. Still had her voice, always. She picked up on the 3rd ring. It's early, she said. I know. What happened? He told her. Quietly, clearly. The way he always told her things, without drama, because she had always seen through drama to whatever was underneath. When he finished, there was a long silence. Then Eleanor said, Did you stay quiet? No, not this time. Another silence. And then his mother said, in a voice lower than he expected, Good. A pause. I taught you wrong, Darnell. He didn't say anything. I taught you that quiet was safe. And maybe it was. Maybe it kept you out of trouble when you needed to stay out of trouble. She stopped. He heard her breathing. But there's a difference between keeping yourself safe and keeping yourself small, and I spent too long teaching you one when I should have been teaching you the other. The plane moved through clear sky. You okay, she asked. I'm fine. Your cheek? He touched it. Still tender. It's fine. A breath. Now call your lawyer. He called Wendell Price at 7:41 a.m. Wendell had been at his desk since 6:30. He picked up on the 2nd ring, which meant he'd seen the name and knew. How bad? Wendell said. Darnell told him. Wendell listened the whole way through without interrupting, which was how Darnell knew he understood the seriousness. When Darnell finished, Wendell said, "The recording. Audio and video both? Both. Duration? 11 minutes 23 seconds from first contact. The slap is at 9:41. Wendell sizzled through his nose and the intercom call. She made it while you were still in the cabin, while I was seated 3 feet from her. So it's all captured, all of it. A pause. The sound of Wendell's pen on paper. I've watched you let things go before, Darnell. More times than I can count. Things that should not have been let go. I know. This time? Darnell looked out the window. The Atlantic coast visible far below, a thin line where land became water. This one doesn't get let go. Wendell put down his pen. Darnell heard the shift, the slight adjustment in posture that meant his lawyer had moved from note-taking to strategy. Then here's what we do. Diana Marsh's feet hit the tarmac at 7:09 a.m. Cold asphalt, cold air, the sound of a jet engine somewhere across the field doing what jet engines do, indifferent, mechanical, loud enough to drown out everything except your own thoughts. She stood there for exactly 3 seconds. Then she pulled out her phone, not to call a friend, not to call HR, not to sit with what just happened and ask herself any of the questions that needed asking. She called Paul Stanton. He picked up on the 4th ring, groggy. She could hear it. 7 in the morning on a Tuesday, and Paul Stanton was the kind of man who needed 2 alarms and a full cup of coffee before he was useful to anyone. Diana, flat, like he already knew. They pulled the manifest, she said. The passenger is the owner. Silence. Not the thinking kind, the held breath kind. Paul, are you listening to me? I heard you. Then you understand what I need. Another silence. This one longer. She counted. Diana, don't. Her voice dropped. Went somewhere colder. You know what's in those files? You know what gets opened if this goes sideways. So you need to decide right now which side of this you're standing on. Paul Stanton said nothing, and then he hung up. Not aggressively, just quietly. The soft click of a man closing a door he should have closed 8 years ago. Diana stared at her phone. The screen went dark. Behind her, the Gulfstream's engines were spooling up. She didn't turn around to watch it leave. Paul Stanton sat in his car in his own driveway for 6 minutes after that call ended. He had been awake since 6. Not because he was an early riser, because something in him had registered the 6:15 reassignment notification that went through the crew management system. It's the system he's access to, not as part of his job exactly, but access nonetheless. And something in him had registered Diana's name attached to a charter flight. And something in him had known, in the wordless way that people who have been avoiding things know, that this particular Tuesday had the shape of a day that would matter. He had not called her. He had not warned the crew. He had not pulled up the client file to see who was on that aircraft. He had made his coffee and read the news and told himself it was nothing. Now, he sat in his car and looked at his steering wheel and thought about a stack of folders in a filing cabinet on the 3rd floor of Atlas Wings' operations building. 3 folders with Diana's name on the tab, and 6 others, different crew members, different incidents, all with his signature at the bottom. Insufficient evidence. No further action required. He had written those words so many times they had stopped meaning anything. That was the thing about administrative language. It was designed to be clean, neutral. It described decisions without requiring you to explain them. You didn't have to say, I am choosing not to investigate this because the person being complained about once did something useful for me, and because the company runs more smoothly when certain things stay filed and forgotten. You just wrote insufficient evidence and put the folder away. Paul had not thought of himself as doing anything wrong. He went inside, made a 2nd cup of coffee, sat at his kitchen table and stared at the wall. His phone buzzed at 8:03 a.m. Unknown number. He didn't answer. 37,000 feet above the eastern seaboard, Darnell Okafor was talking to his lawyer. Wendell Price laid out 4 steps. Clean, sequenced, surgical. First, a formal assault complaint filed with Teterboro Airport Police. Full recording attached as primary evidence. Filed before the aircraft wheels touched Charleston. Second, the recording sent to Atlas Wing Aviation's legal department with a demand letter attached. Written response required within 48 hours. Not a courtesy copy, a demand. Third, a formal request for the complete employment history of Diana Marsh. Every complaint, every disciplinary note, every file Paul Stanton had ever touched with her name on it. Fourth, formal notification that Pinnacle Bridge Group was placing its charter management contract with Atlas Wing Aviation under immediate review. $12 million a year, the company's single largest client relationship. Darnell approved every word before Wendell finished reading them. Letters go out before your wheels touch Charleston, Wendell said. Good, Darnell. Yeah, this is going to get it loud. A pause, long enough to be real. I know, Darnell said. The call ended. Darnell sat for a moment with the phone in his hand. Outside the window, the sky was completely clear. The kind of blue that makes you feel like the world is holding still just for a second. He thought about his mother's voice. I taught you wrong. He had been turning those 4 words over since the call ended, examining them the way you examine something fragile, carefully, from different angles, making sure you understood what you were holding before you put it down. Eleanor Okafor was not a woman who said things she didn't mean. She did not apologize casually or revise herself lightly. She had spent decades being right about most things, and she knew it, and she didn't perform false modesty about it. So when she said, I taught you wrong, she meant it completely. And the weight of that, not the anger, not the vindication, not any of the louder emotions that were available to him right now. The weight of that was what settled in his chest and stayed. He thought about all the times he had walked away. The hotel in Chicago in 2014. A restaurant in Dallas where a table he had reserved wasn't ready for 45 minutes, but was suddenly available when his white colleague arrived. A meeting room in Seattle where the building security had asked him for his badge twice in 10 minutes, while the other men in suits walked past without being stopped. Every time he had been patient, professional. He had adjusted his expectations downward to meet the reality of his environment and then moved on. Because that was what his mother taught him. Because that was what survival looked like. But here was the question he hadn't been willing to ask until now. Every time he adjusted, every time he absorbed it and moved on and said nothing, who else paid the price for his silence? Who sat in a seat after him and experienced the same thing with no recording, no lawyer on speed dial, no aircraft with their name on the registration. Just their word, and their word alone was never going to be enough. He picked up his phone again. Not Wendell this time, Adeze. His wife answered before the second ring, which meant she was already awake, which meant the note on the counter had not been enough, which meant Adeze Okafor, 49 years old, co-founder of a design firm that had rebuilt its entire client base twice and never once lost its reputation, had been awake since before 7, with the particular alertness of a woman who knows when her husband is not okay. Tell me, she said. So he told her. The whole thing, and this time, unlike with Wendell, unlike even with his mother, he told her the parts that lived underneath the facts. The moment Diana's eyes moved across him in the cavern, that recognizable scan he had been receiving since he was 15 and had once gotten used to. The sound the bag made when it hit the floor, the way the cabin felt in the silence after. Adeze listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "How's your face?" "Fine." "Darnell." "It's fine, Adeze." A beat. Wendell knows. "He's already filing." "Good." Then, without pause, "You are going to handle this quietly." Not a question. He didn't answer. "You are going to keep it contained," she said. "Make the demands. Take the settlement. Keep your name out of it." Still not answering. "Darnell." Her voice shifted, not harder, more direct. The way Adeze got when she was about to say something she had been thinking for a long time and had decided it was finally the right moment. How many times have you told me about something like this and then let it go? Quietly. You know the answer. The hotel in Chicago, yes. The restaurant in Dallas. Yes. The building in Seattle. Twice. Yes. And every time, she said, you made the same calculation. Not worth the noise. Not worth the attention. Keep building. Don't let them make you the story. A pause. I understand why. I have always understood why you did it. Silence. But Darnell, she stopped. In the pause, he could picture her exactly, standing in the kitchen in Montclair, looking out the window at the backyard he'd looked at that morning. Your silence has not only cost you. Every time you absorbed it and moved on, someone else sat down after you. Someone with no recording, no Wendell, no aircraft with their name on the registration. And they got the same thing you got. And they had nothing. He closed his eyes. I know, he said. So this time, Adeze said, don't be quiet. Not a command, not an ultimatum. Just the truth, spoken by the one person in the world who had earned the right to say it to him directly. All right, he said. Call Brooke Calloway. Brooke Calloway had spent 17 years building a reputation for doing exactly one thing well. Finding the story underneath the story. She had broken 3 major corporate discrimination cases in 8 years. She had a waiting list of sources who wanted to talk to her and a shorter list of editors she actually trusted. She was 44 years old, relentless in a way that never looked like effort, and she had a particular focus on discrimination cases in the service and hospitality industries. That focus was not purely professional. 4 years earlier, Brooke's younger sisters, Beverly, had been traveling alone on a commercial flight out of Atlanta. Business class, confirmed ticket, window seat. Beverly's at the time, a pediatric nurse. She dressed the way people dress when they want nobody to bother them. Neat, unremarkable, headphones in from the moment she sat down. The flight attendant asked Beverly to verify her boarding pass. Once fine, twice odd. 3 times, Beverly asked why. The attendant said she needed to confirm. Beverly was in the right section. Beverly was in exactly the right section. Had been the whole time. The attendant walked away without another word. Beverly sat there for the rest of the 2-hour flight in the specific, exhausting silence of someone who has just been told, without any words at all, that they don't belong somewhere they have every right to be. Beverly filed a complaint. The airline reviewed it and closed it within 2 weeks. Insufficient evidence. No witnesses willing to go on record. Beverly called Brooke. And Brooke had tried. She had written a draft. She had taken it to her editor at the time. A careful man, good instincts, risk-averse. He read it and said, genuinely apologetic. We need something stronger. A recording. A corroborating witness on record. Something the legal team can stand behind. Brooke did not have something stronger. The story didn't run. Beverly moved on. People do. You process it, and then you go back to work and you try not to let it make you smaller. Try not to let it reshape the way you move through the world. But it does. It always does, a little. And the people who did it never knew. Never faced anything. Never had to sit with what they'd done. Brooke had not stopped thinking about it. So when Wendell Price called her on a Tuesday morning with a recording that was 11 minutes and 23 seconds long, she sat down at her kitchen table and listened. She got to the 3-minute mark. She stopped the playback. She sat espressi. Then she pressed play again and listened to the rest without stopping. When it ended, she put the phone face down on the table and pressed both hands flat against the wood and breathed. Not because she was surprised. She was not surprised. She had been covering this territory for 17 years, and almost nothing surprised her anymore. She needed a moment, because what she had just heard was, in almost every detail, what Beverly had described from that Atlanta flight 4 years ago. The tone, the precision of the dismissal, the way authority gets used as a weapon by people who have learned they face no consequences for using it that way. Beverly hadn't had a recording. This man did. Brooke picked up her phone, called Wendell back. I need 4 days to verify everything. You have it. I want the security logs from Teterboro, the flight manifest, The intercom call transcript, the prior complaints, if they exist. End of day. And I want to speak to the junior attendant. On record, a pause. I'll ask. Wendell. She looked out her kitchen window. Kids walking to school. A dog pulling its owner down the sidewalk. Tell him this story matters. Not just for him. For everyone this has happened to who didn't have what he had. Wendell said he'd relay the message. He didn't need to. Darnell Okafor had already said himself. Sophie Reeves landed back in New Jersey at 2:15 p.m. Not on the Gulf Stream. On a commercial shuttle that Atlas Wing had arranged when Captain Hollins filed the crew incident report. And the aircraft was placed under operational review for the duration of the investigation. Standard procedure. Bureaucratic. The kind of thing that happened automatically when the paperwork said it should. She had her bag, her uniform still pressed, her mind going in several directions at once. What she had said on the aircraft that morning felt both very simple and very complicated, depending on which moment she came at it from. In the moment itself, when she had stepped out of the galley and looked at Officer Devereaux and started talking, it had felt like the only thing available to her. Now sitting on a shuttle bus with a carry-on between her feet, it felt more like standing on the edge of something and having already jumped and only now looking down. Her phone had 11 messages, 7 from colleagues asking what happened. One from her mother in Charlotte saying she'd heard something through a friend who knew someone at Teterboro, and was Sophie okay? 2 from numbers she didn't recognize. And 1 from a Wendell Price, attorney-at-law, explaining who he was and asking if she would be willing to speak with Brooke Calloway, a journalist preparing a piece on the incident, at her complete discretion. No obligation. Sophie read that message 3 times. Then she looked out the bus window at the turnpike in November. Gray sky, gray asphalt. She thought about the family from 6 months ago. Mother, father, 2 small kids. Business class tickets in their hands. Diana's voice going to that register. That particular, practiced register that managed to be perfectly polite and completely contemptuous at the same time. And Sophie had been in the galley with a tray, and she had thought about saying something. She had not said something. The family had sat there for the whole flight. They hadn't complained. They'd probably the same calculation Darnell Okafor had made for 37 years. Not worth the noise. Get home. Sophie had gotten home that night and had not been able to sleep and had not fully understood why until now. She understood now. She typed a reply to Wendell Price. Yes, she would speak with Brooke Calloway. On record, she pressed send. Put her phone in her pocket. Watched New Jersey go by. Clifford Greer arrived at his Manhattan office at 8:15 a.m. He was a methodical man, mid-50s, the kind of tan that comes from weekends on Long Island, rather than anything tropical. He had built Atlas Wing Aviation over 20 years into a company synonymous with discretion. That was the brand. That was the promise. You trusted Atlas Wing not just with your aircraft management, but with your reputation. His assistant had flagged the email before he'd taken off his coat. Subject line from Wendell Price. Formal notice. Client incident. Charter. November 12. Greer read it standing up. Then he sat down. Then he opened the attached recording and pressed play. He listened for 11 minutes. When it ended, he sat with both hands flat on his desk and stared at nothing in particular for a while. He pressed play a second time. Not because he'd missed anything. Because some part of his brain where it became ambiguous. Where there was room for interpretation. Where someone could make a reasonable argument that it wasn't what it sounded like. That moment didn't come. The third time, he went directly to 9 minutes 41 seconds. The slap was clear as a gunshot. He pressed stop. And then, because his brain was the kind of brain that always looked for its own culpability last, he went to his files. His assistant kept paper backups for anything flagged with his name. He went to the folder for the previous year, flipped through slowly. Looks out for something he half remembered. Something that had sat at the edge of his attention and never quite made it to the center. He found it on the 3rd page, An internal forwarded email from 14 months ago. Subject, FYI, client complaint, crew member D. Marsh. He had opened it. He could see from the metadata that he had opened it the day it arrived. He had read the summary. A black passenger had reported that Diana Marshish had been dismissive and had questioned his right to occupy a premium section without cause. He had typed one word in response, noted, and forwarded it to HR and moved on with his day. He sat now and held that paper in his hands. He had not followed up, had not asked what happened next, had not required anyone to report back to him. He had a full calendar that day. A board call in the afternoon, a dinner in the evening. The email had arrived and been processed and been absorbed into the machinery of a company that was running well enough, that a single complaint about a single crew member didn't seem to require his personal attention. 14 months, 3 more passengers since then, and now this. Greer set the paper down, picked up his phone, called Wendell Price. Wendell answered immediately. "Mr. Greer, I'd like to speak to Mr. Okafor directly." Mr. Okafor is not taking calls from Atlas Wing at this time. All communication should come to me in writing. You have 48 hours to respond to the formal notice. Greer exhaled. Wendell, I've known Darnell for. The clock starts from the timestamp on the email. 48 hours. The line went quiet. Not because the call dropped. Because Wendell Price had nothing more to say, and Clifford Greer had nothing left to argue. Paul Stanton's office was accessed by Atlas Wing's internal audit team on Thursday morning, not dramatically. No people in suits carrying boxes. Just 2 members of the audit team, a company lawyer named Harriet Voss, who wore glasses and said very little, and a file request that covered everything Paul signed off on in the last 6 years. Paul's present for the entire thing. He sat in the corner of his own office and watched them work. He answered questions when asked. He pointed to the right filing cabinets. He gave Harriet his computer password when she asked and watched her type it in without expression. 9 complaints. That was the number that emerged over 3 hours of file review. Not just Diana's 3. 9 total. Different crew members, different passengers, different dates. See same notation every single time in Paul Stanton's handwriting or typed under his name. Insufficient evidence. No further action required. Harriet Voss looked up from the files. Her voice had no particular emotion in it. Mr. Stanton, were all of these complaints reviewed by you personally? Yes. And in each case, you determined there was insufficient evidence. That's what the files indicate. Did you conduct interviews in any of these cases? A pause. Some of them. Which ones? He couldn't answer quickly enough. Harriet looked back at the files, made a note. Paul sat in his corner and understood, for the first time with real clarity, what the word consequences felt like when it was pointed at you rather than someone else. He thought about Diana's call that morning. The 11-second silence before he hung up. He had told himself, in the hours since, that she'd chosen not to speak because he was processing, because he needed time to think. But the truth was simpler and harder than that. He had hung up because he had known, in that moment, that there was no version of the next conversation that ended well for him. And so he had chosen the only exit available, silence, one more time. Same as always. And it was going to cost him the same way it always cost people who chose silence when the truth was already in the room. Brooke Calloway worked for 4 days. She verified the flight manifest with Teterborough's operations center directly. She pulled the security logs from the morning of the incident. She obtained the complete intercom call transcript from Atlas Wing's internal communications record, which were legally the company's property and therefore subject to their own disclosure requirements. She interviewed Sophie Reeves for 2 hours on a Thursday afternoon in a coffee shop in Hoboken. Sophie was careful at first, precise in the way people are precise when they know their words are going somewhere that matters. Then, gradually, something else settled in. Not relaxation exactly, but the particular steadiness that comes from having a true story to tell and telling it in the same order every time. Brooke had conducted enough interviews to know the difference between a witness who is constructing a narrative and one who is simply remembering what happened. Sophie was the second kind. She described events in sequence. She acknowledged what she couldn't see clearly. She didn't editorialize. When Brooke asked why she hadn't spoken up immediately, Sophie was quiet for a moment. "Because I was scared," she said. "But then I thought about what I was actually choosing by staying quiet, and I couldn't choose it again." Brooke wrote that down and underlined it. She reached out to Diana Marsh for comment. Diana's lawyer, a man named Roy Hecht, who specialized in employment disputes and had the practiced demeanor of someone nothing shocked anymore, sent a 2-sentence response. "Ms. Marsh disputes the characterization of events and will not be providing further comment pending the resolution of any proceedings." Through a source inside Atlas Wing who had not been asked to keep anything confidential and was therefore not violating any obligation in speaking to her, Brooke obtained the summary findings of the internal audit. 9 complaints, 6 years, 1 manager's signature on all of them. She sat at her kitchen table on a Friday night and wrote the article. She had written many hard pieces. She had written about companies that didn't want to be written about, and individuals with powerful lawyers and industries that protected themselves with silence and the sheer exhaustion of fighting. This piece was different. This one had a recording, and a recording Brooke had learned over 17 years changed everything. Not because the facts were different, but because a recording didn't let people choose what to believe. It made them hear it with their own ears, in their own time, in their own kitchen or living room at whatever hour they found it. And once you heard it, you couldn't unhear it. She finished the draft at 11:40 p.m. Read it once. Changed 2 sentences. Then she went to the headline. She typed, "He's sitting in his own seat. What happened next exposed years of ignored complaints at Atlas Wing Aviation." She looked at it. Then she added the subheading, "And the 9 complaints nobody read." She saved the file, poured a glass of water, stood at the kitchen window. Thought about Beverly the way she always thought about Beverly when she finished a piece that mattered. Beverly was fine, that was important to remember. She was 33 now, still a nurse, still herself. She had moved on. But the flight attendant who had made her show her boarding pass 3 times had also moved on. Had probably moved on 100 times since. Had never had to stop and account for it. Never had to sit in a room and answer for what she had done. That was the mechanism. That was how it continued. Not through dramatic villains who knew exactly what they were doing, but through ordinary people who did something wrong and faced nothing for it, and so did it again and again, until someone had a recording, or a lawyer who answered on the second ring, or a sister who worked in journalism. Brooke set down her glass. Tomorrow, 6 a.m. The article would go up and the world would hear 11 minutes and 23 seconds of audio that couldn't be argued with. And the 9 complaints that had been sitting in a drawer for 6 years would finally be read. By everyone. Clifford Greer received Wendell Price's formal demands on Wednesday afternoon. He read them in his office with Harriet Voss seated across from him. 3 demands. 1. A public acknowledgement that Atlas Wing's internal complaint process had failed to identify and address a pattern of discriminatory conduct over a multi-year period. 2. A full independent audit of Atlas Wing's HR and complaint procedures, conducted by an outside civil rights organization with no financial relationship to the company. 3. Mandatory bias training for every Atlas Wing employee. Flight crews, ground staff, management, executive leadership, designed and delivered by the same independent organization and funded entirely by Atlas Wing. Harriet threw the demands twice. Then she said, "He's not asking for money." "No," Greer said. "That's unusual." "Yes." She looked at him over her glasses. "A money demand you can negotiate. A demand for structural change. You either do it or you don't." Greer looked at the window. Ordinary Wednesday afternoon for most people. "What's your recommendation?" he asked. Harriet set the papers down. Accept. All three. Don't negotiate. Don't counter. Don't ask for time. Accept as written. Begin implementing immediately and document every step. A pause. Because if you don't, and this recording becomes public, you won't be responding to 3 demands. You'll be responding to a congressional inquiry. Greer was quiet for a moment. There's also the contract, Harriet said. I know. $12 million a year. I know, Harriet. She gave him a moment. Then I pulled the file on the complaint that came to your desk 14 months ago. Greer nodded slowly. You marked it noted and forwarded it to HR. Yes, without follow-up. Silence. Clifford. Her voice changed, not harder, more direct. This is the part where I stop being your lawyer for a moment. You didn't create the problem. Diana Marsh created the problem. Paul Stanton made it possible for it to continue for 6 years. But you had information, one piece of information, 14 months ago, and you chose not to look at it more closely. And now everything that followed is in part a consequence of that choice. She let that sit. Accept the demands, she said again, and then figure out how to make the company something different from what it was. Greer picked up the papers, looked at them one more time. Then he picked up the phone and called Wendell Price. Wendell Price accepted the call at 4:17 p.m. on Wednesday. He listened to Clifford Greer's voice for 11 seconds. Then he said, "Hold, please." He muted the call, picked up his other line, called Darnell. Greer is accepting all 3 demands. No modifications, no counter. Darnell was in Charleston. In the middle of what had turned out to be a 14-hour parley of acquisition negotiations that had nothing to do with any of this and everything to do with the fact that he was a man who did not stop working because the world decided to test him. He was standing outside a glass-walled conference room, jacket on, coffee in hand, looking at nothing in particular. And the contract? He asked. Wendell was quiet for exactly 1 beat. He didn't offer to retain it, right? Darnell, the contract ends. Give him 60 days for a professional transition. Then we're done. A pause. That's $12 million a year. I know what it is. I'm not arguing. I just want to make sure you. Wendell. Final. Telese was awake when he called that night. 11 p.m. He was still in Charleston. It's done, he said, and the contract terminated. A silence on her end. Not surprised. Processing. How do you feel, she asked. He thought about that. Standing in his hotel room. Jacket off. Shoes off. Looking at the ceiling the way he looked at ceilings at the end of days that had required a lot from him. Like I should have done it sooner, he said. Adiz was quiet. Not this specifically, he said. Just all of it. Said something sooner. Stopped absorbing it and moving on. You were surviving, she said. Yeah. And now? He thought about Brooke Calloway's draft, which he had read that afternoon. The 9 complaints laid out in sequence. Paul Stanton's signature at the bottom of each one. The recording that was going to live on the internet and make it impossible for anyone who heard it to claim they hadn't understood what this looked like. Now I'm doing something else, he said. Ade said, good. He could hear the warmth in it, the particular warmth that was not soft but solid. The warmth of a woman who had been waiting for this specific answer for a very long time and was not going to make a production of it now that it had arrived. Get some sleep, she said. Yeah, Darnell. Yeah, I'm proud of you. He didn't say anything back. He let it land. The article went live at 6 a.m. on a Thursday. By 9, the clips embedded in Brooks' piece had been shared 40,000 times. By noon, 400,000. By the time Darnell boarded his return flight that evening, the number had stopped being useful information. It was just everywhere, every platform, every format. Cable news running segments, morning shows pulling clips, sending the link based to in years with a single line of text above it. Listen to this. And underneath all of it, in every comment section, and every group chat and every conversation that started up in offices and kitchens across the country, one thing kept surfacing. Not just outrage at the slap, though there was plenty of that. Something smaller, more specific, more personal. The 9 complaints. People kept coming back to the 9 complaints, to the 6 years, to the words insufficient evidence written over and over in a stack folders, galactics that had been sitting in a cabinet. Well, the peeps inside those folders went back to their lives and tried to move on and were never told that someone had decided this didn't count. That was the part that traveled furthest. Not because it was the most dramatic detail, because it was the most familiar one. Because somewhere in America, on that Thursday morning, a very large number of people read about those 9 complaints and recognized them. Not as news, as their own lives. Nobody read mine either, that sentence, in different words, from every direction. Nobody read mine either. The district attorney's office filed charges on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the incident, 2 weeks after the article. Long enough for the full evidentiary picture to be assembled. Short enough that nobody could accuse the DA of moving slowly for political reasons. 2 counts. Count 1, simple assault, based on the recorded slap. Corroborated by Sophie Reeves's signed statement and Frank Devereaux's incident report, filed the morning of the incident before anyone knew what the morning would become. Count 2, filing a false report. Based on the recorded intercom call, in which Diana Marsh has stated that the passenger grabbed her arm and became physically aggressive. Statements directly contradicted by the video evidence and every witness present on the aircraft. Roy Hecht called Diana when the charges came through. His voice was the same as always. Calm, measured. The practiced steadiness of a man who had promised himself a long time ago that he would not become emotionally invested in outcomes he couldn't control. We expected this, he said. I know. I've reached out to the DA's office about a plea arrangement. Silence on her end. Diana, listen to me carefully. The recording exists. Every word you said on that intercom is captured. I can construct arguments around the physical contact, the graze, the reflex, the perception of threat. But the intercom call is a different problem entirely. A pause. Because you said specific things. Specific things that the recording shows did not happen. Diana sat on her couch in her apartment with the curtains still drawn when. She had kept them drawn since Thursday morning when the article went live. She had not been outside except get the mail. What do they want? She asked. A guilty plea on both counts. In exchange, they're recommending the lower sentencing range. Probation, community service, fines, no jail time, no jail time. She looked at the wall across from her, a framed photo. A layover in some city she couldn't remember clearly anymore. Smiling, uniform pressed, 13 years ago when everything was ahead of her, and if we go to trial. Roy Hecht was quiet for a moment. Then we go to trial, he said. And I represent you to the best of my ability. But Diana, you need to understand what a jury is going to hear in that courtroom. They are going to hear 11 minutes and 23 seconds of audio and video evidence, unedited. They are going to hear Sophie Reeves testify in person. They are going to hear Frank Devereaux's incident report read into the record by a prosecutor who has done this many times before. A pause. And then you're going to have to take a stand. Diana said nothing for a long time. Then, we go to trial. Roy Hecht exhaled once, slowly. All right, he said. Then let's prepare. Diana Marsh spent the weeks between the charges and the trial in a version of her life she didn't recognize. She had lived alone for 11 years. She had always been fine with that, fine with the order of her own space. The predictability of her own routines, the particular freedom of not having to account for herself to anyone when she came home. Now, the apartment felt like a container rather than a home. She moved through it, room to room, without purpose. She made coffee and let it go cold. She watched television without registering what was on. Roy Hecht called twice a week. Preparation sessions. He walked her through questions, coached her on posture, on pacings, on the specific language to use and avoid. He was thorough and patient and professional. She went through the motions of it. What she could not tell Roy Hecht, what she could not tell anyone because she had no language for it yet, was the thing that happened every time she replayed the morning in her own mind. She had replayed it hundreds of times by now. searching for the moment where she could insert a different choice, where she could have paused, checked the manifest, asked one more question before deciding she already knew the answer. And every time she looked for that moment, she found it. It was there, right there at the beginning. 1/2 second in the cabin doorway when she had looked at a man in a hoodie and made a decision so fast she hadn't even known she was making it. She could not tell Roy Heck that part. So instead, she talked about procedures and protocols and the stress of last-minute reassignments and the lack of adequate time to review client profiles. Roy Hecht wrote all of it down, and the trial approached. The trial was set for a Thursday in February. It lasted 3 days, which was about 2 days longer than most legal observers thought the evidence warranted, and 3 days shorter than Roy Hecht managed to stretch it through procedural motions and carefully constructed questions designed to introduce small amounts of doubt into small spaces. The courtroom was a mid-sized room on the 4th floor of the county courthouse. Wood paneling. Fluorescent overhead lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell. 12 jurors in 2 rows of 6, with the particular attentiveness of people who understand they are being asked to do something that matters. The gallery was full on all 3 days. Reporters, legal observers, members of the public who had followed the story since Brooke Calloway's article and had driven from different parts of the state to sit in wooden chairs for hours just to be in the same room where the thing would be decided. The first day belonged to the prosecution. Clara Voss, the assistant district attorney, was precise and unhurried. She had the build of someone who ran long distances on weekends and the manner of someone who had made peace a long time ago with being underestimated. She didn't use extra words. She didn't perform for the gallery. She set up the case in 18 minutes of opening statement. Incident, recording, witness, false report. The sequence was not complicated. She didn't try to make it complicated. Then she played the recording. Not clips, not highlights. The complete 11 minutes and 23 seconds. The courtroom was very quiet while it played. Not the performed quiet of people being respectful at an occasion. The involuntary quiet of people who have stopped breathing slightly because they are hearing something that doesn't leave room for distraction. Diana's voice asking for the confirmation, the flat, certain tone of it, the dismissal of the booking screen, the sound of a bag being moved, the sound of that same bag hitting the floor, footsteps, a voice asking to speak to the captain, then silence. Then, at 9 minutes 41 seconds, the crack, clean and flat and final, followed by Diana's voice shifting registers. 4 seconds, from force to fragility. The intercom call, her words clear and specific and directly contradicted by everything the jury had just heard. When the recording ended, Clara Voss let the silence sit for 10 full seconds. Then she said, "The prosecution rests on day 1. She didn't need more than that. Day 2 was Sophie Reeves. She came in wearing a dark blazer, hair pulled back, hands folded in her lap once she was seated in the witness box. She looked like what she was. A 26-year-old woman who had spent the months between November and February thinking carefully about what she was going to say in this room. The direct examination took 40 minutes. Sophie described what she had seen from the galley doorway in the same order it had happened. Her voice was steady throughout, not the performed steadiness of someone plunging easy emotions for an audience. The real kind. The kind that comes from having told a true story enough times so that it has settled into something solid that doesn't require effort to hold. She described the booking confirmation being dismissed, the bag being taken without permission, Darnell standing up, the bag hitting the floor, the second approach, Diana reaching for the headphones on the armrest, and Darnell's arm moving. She used those exact words, moving away, not pushing forward, not reaching out, just pulling back from something coming into his space. And then the slap. Roy Hecht took his time on cross-examination. He was a skilled lawyer, and he had found 2 things he could work with. First, the galley doorway had an angle, a partial obstruction from the forward equipment housing. Was it possible, he asked, that Sophie's sightline to certain moments had been limited by that obstruction? Sophie considered the question. I could see the main cabin from where I was standing, she said. I've described what I saw. But you can't guarantee your view was completely unsubstructed at every moment during the interaction. I've told you what I saw. He moved on. Second, Yanka Sophie had not spoken up immediately. There had been a period, he was careful not to call it hesitation, a period before she stepped forward to address Officer Devereaux. Did she agree that was accurate? Yes. Can you tell the jury why? Sophie looked at him. Because I was afraid of what it would cost me professionally, she said. And then I decided that fear was not a good enough reason to let someone lie about what happened in front of me. Roy Hecht nodded slowly, as if considering this. There was nothing more to find there. He moved on. Day 3 was the defense. Roy Hecht was not without resources. He called a works safety consultant who testified about the elevated stress conditions of in-flight conflict situations and the difficulty of making split-second judgments in enclosed environments at altitude. He called a former aviation industry HR specialist who discussed the complexity of passenger-crew interactions and the inherent ambiguity of seating authority disputes. He built a careful, methodical architecture of context, and then he called Diana Marsh. She came to the stand in a gray dress, composed. Roy had spent hours preparing her for this. The posture, the pace, the specific language to reach for, and the specific language to avoid. She described feeling threatened. She described the physical contact, the graze of Desaulnel's hand against her forearm, in terms that made it sound considered rather than reflexive. She described her state of mind, her years of service, her genuine commitment to the safety and comfort of every passenger she had ever served. She described the slap as a response, a reflex action in a moment where she had perceived immediate physical threat. Roy Hecht nodded throughout. His face communicated. Reasonable, understandable, human. Then Clara Voss stood up. She walked to the center of the courtroom. She did not look at her notes. She looked at Diana Marsh directly, and she asked exactly one question. Mrs. Marsh, she said, can you explain to this jury why you assumed Mr. Okafor did not belong in the owner's suite of his own aircraft when he boarded? Diana opened her mouth, closed it. The jury watched. The gallery watched. The judge watched. He didn't look like. She started. Stopped. Her mouth was open. The words were right there, the honest words, the only accurate answer to the question. She could feel them pressing forward, and she could not say them, and she could not stop them from almost being said. And the courtroom heard what she was stopping herself from, saying as clearly as if she had stood up and announced it. He didn't look like someone who belonged there, because he was black. That was the whole of it, the entire thing. From the first half-second in the cabin doorway to where she was standing now. All of it traced back to one moment when she had looked at a man in a hoodie and decided she already knew what she was looking at. She never finished the sentence. Clara Voss said nothing further and sat down. The jury deliberated for 82 minutes, which, in the vocabulary of jury deliberations, is not really deliberating. It is confirming. It is 12 people who have all seen the same thing, making sure they have all seen it the same way. They had. Guilty. Both counts. Diana stood when the verdict was read. She didn't cry. She didn't react visibly. She stood completely still, looking at a point on the far wall that had no particular significance, like a woman watching something close that she had known for a long time was going to close and had spent a long time hoping wouldn't. The sentencing came 6 weeks later. 24 months probation. 250 hours of community service at a civil education center designated by the court. An $18,000 fine. A permanent criminal record on every background check card for the rest of her professional life. Roy Hecht told the press they were reviewing their options. They did not pursue further options. Darnell Okafor was not in the courtroom when the verdict was read. He was in a hospital corridor in Baltimore. Room 14B at the end of the hall. Antiseptic smell. Bolted chairs against the walls. a vending machine at the far end that hummed slightly louder than it should. Eleanor had been admitted 4 days earlier. Mild stroke. The doctors were measured, not falsely reassuring, not alarming. She was responsive. Her speech slightly slower than usual. She was, according to every nurse who came through her room, a woman who had already decided she was going to recover and was making that intention known. At 2:17 p.m., his phone buzzed. Wendell Price. Verdicts in and guilty. Both counts. Darnell looked at the vending machine. The hum of it. The fluorescent light above it, slightly off color compared to the others. Sentencing, he asked. 6 weeks out. Okay, how's Eleanor? Resting. How are you? He looked down the corridor at the closed door of room 14B. I'll call you tomorrow, he said. He ended the call. Sat with the terrible vending machine coffee and thought about his mother's voice on the phone in November. 37,000 feet over a gray coastline, his face still stinging. I taught you wrong. He had been living with those words for 3 months. And what he had come to understand slowly was this. She had taught him wrong. She had taught him to survive. In a world that had very specific ideas about what his presence meant and what his word was worth, survival had looked like quiet. But every time he had absorbed something and moved on, someone else had experienced the same thing afterward. With less. With nothing. No recording, no Wendell, no tail number with their name on it. And they had gone home and written a complaint, and someone like Paul Stanton had written 2 words at the bottom. Insufficient evidence, and nothing had changed. He stood up, threw away the coffee, walked to room 14B, and pushed the door open quietly. Eleanor was awake. She looked at him from the pillow, her eyes the same as always. Miss Nissen, even now, even here. Well, she said. Guilty, he said. Both counts. Eleanor looked at the ceiling for a moment. Good, she said. Darnell pulled the chair close and sat down. Neither of them said anything for a while. They had always been good at that. The particular silence of people who know each other well enough that the silence itself carries meaning. The Web Dignity Fund was incorporated the same week the charges were filed. $12 million. Independent board. People who had spent careers in civil rights litigation and legal services access, with no financial ties to Darnell or Pinnacle Bridge. The mandate was simple. Free legal representation for individuals who experienced racial discrimination in the service and hospitality industries, airlines, hotels, restaurants, retailers. Priority given to cases where the complainant had no recording, no corroborating witness, no resources to sustain a legal fight. The cases nobody reads, no press conference, no announcement. Brooke Calloway wrote 2 factual paragraphs about the launch. That was the extent of the public communication. The work was not a statement. The work was the work. In the first year, the fund took on 94 cases. 51 resolved through mediation or settlement. The organizations on the other side had not changed because they were suddenly good people. They changed because a formal legal demand backed by competent representation was a different experience from an individual complaint with no support. That was the mechanism, not shame, accountability. 27 cases closed without resolution. Evidence too thin. Organizations with lawyers good at running out the clock. That number was the one Darnell looked at longest in the quarterly reports. Those were the people who had done everything right. Found the intake form, told their story carefully, and still hadn't gotten what they deserved. He reviewed every report personally, not because Wendell needed him to, because he wanted to know the names. 16 cases went to formal proceedings. 12 reached settlement. 4 went to trial, all 4 won. Paul Stanton was terminated for cause on a Friday, severance revoked. 9 complaints across 6 years, all bearing his signature. He packed a box, computer, books, a photo of his kids from a baseball game 3 summers ago. He didn't say goodbye many people. Some of them were already finding somewhere else to look when he walked past. Not because they disliked him. Because looking at Paul Stanton required thinking about a question they would rather not sit with, whether they would have done the same thing. Clifford Greer accepted all 3 demands within 48 hours. The independent audit took 8 weeks and found what thorough people always find when they examine things that haven't been examined carefully. A pattern. Not just Diana Marsh, not just Paul Stanton. A broader tendency to prioritize crew convenience over passenger complaint. A process that created the appearance of accountability without the substance. Greer released the full 48-page report publicly. Harriet Voss had advised against it. He released it anyway, because he was thinking about the email he had marked noted 14 months ago and forwarded and forgotten, and because the decision about what kind of company Atlas Wing would be going forward started with not hiding what needed to be seen. 3 additional employees were terminated. The mandatory training program launched 8 weeks later. Every employee, every level. Greer sat in the leadership session in the 3rd row and did check his phone. He resigned 14 months after the incident. Not because the board asked, because he had decided the person who led a company through this kind of reckoning probably should not be the same person whose inattention had made it necessary. His successor was Denise Farwell, 41 years old, 9 years at Atlas Wing. Passed over for promotion twice, sometimes the audit had documented with careful precision. In her first company-wide address, she said, "This company made serious mistakes. The work of addressing them is not finished, but it is real and it will continue." She did not mention Darnell Okafor. She talked about the work. Sophie Reeves got the call from Northern Crest Aviation on a Thursday morning in January, senior flight attendant. A title that would have taken 5 more years at Atlas Wing. "Can I ask who the new charter contract is with?" she said. "Pinnacle Bridge Group." She accepted before he finished telling her the salary. 6 months later, an aviation trade magazine asked what had made her speak up that morning. She thought about it for a long time. 6 months before that day, she said, "I watched Diana treat a black family with business class tickets like they didn't belong. They just sat down and didn't say anything. I went home that night and couldn't sleep." A pause. "That morning, I decided I wasn't going to add another person to that list." Diana Marsh completed her community service in Nashville over 14 months. She applied to 4 airlines after her termination. All 4 declined. 3 hospitality companies, same result. Her name circulated in HR departments, not as a person but as a reference point. A case cited in the new compliance training modules, appearing across the industry. A local reporter found her 8 months after the trial. Working retail in a small city south of Nashville, she declined to comment. The reporter turned to leave. Diana called after him. He stopped. She stood in the doorway with the afternoon light behind her. "I didn't think he was the owner of the plane," she said. The reporter waited. She didn't say anything else. He wrote it down. Not because it was a revelation, because of what it revealed in its plainness. Not an excuse, not an explanation. Just a woman still standing in a doorway she'd walked through a long time ago, finally looking at what she had walked past. Darnell Okafor drove Eleanor home from Meadowbrook on a Saturday in March. She didn't want a wheelchair to the car. She told the nurse that directly, in the voice she used when a decision had already been made and further conversation was not required. The nurse handed her a cane instead. Eleanor looked at it for a moment, then she took it. Small negotiations. She was good at those. The drive from Baltimore to the house on Presbury took 22 minutes. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap and watched the city go by without commenting on it. She had lived in this city for 51 years. She had watched it change in ways that were good and ways that were not, and she had kept her opinions about most of it to herself. Darnell parked in the driveway. Hay came around her side. She let him help her out. Another small negotiation, acceptance without announcement. And they walked to the front door slowly, her cane on the left, his hand available on the right without being insisted upon. The house smelled the same. That was the first thing Darnell noticed every time he came back here. The particular smell of a house that had been someone's home for a very long time. Wood and old books and something faintly floral that had no tingle source he had ever been able to identify. He made tea. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table. The same table, same chairs, same window looking out on the same backyard that had not changed in any significant way in 37 years. The tree his mother had planted the year he started at Howard was bare still. Just begin to consider what spring might ask of it. He set the tea in front of her and sat down across from her. For a while, neither of them said anything. That had always been one of their better qualities. The ability to be in the same room without filling it. Eleanor wrapped both hands around the mug, looked at the window. Then she said, "The wet store is still there on Presbury." Darnell looked at her. "Corner store." Different name now, different people. She paused, but still there. He didn't say anything. "I think about that morning sometimes," she said. "You were 15. You had exact change in your hand because I told you to always have exact change." She looked down at the mug. "And when you came out, I could see it on your face. And I sat you down that night, and I told you that sometimes quiet was the smartest thing." "Mama, let me finish." He did. "I told you that because I believed it, because I had seen what happened to men who made noise, to men who pushed back. And I was scared for you. So I taught you to make yourself smaller, to absorb things and move on, and not give anyone a reason to look at you twice." She stopped. Outside, the tree in the backyard stood still in the thin March light. "And you did exactly what I taught you. For 37 years. Darnell looked at his mother's hands around the mug. The history in them. Everything they had made. "You kept me safe," he said. "I kept you small," she said. "There's a difference, and I mixed them up for too long." The kitchen was very quiet. "You're not wrong," Darnell said. "Both things were true at the same time." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes still sharp. Still the eyes that had never let him get away with anything approximate. "Maybe," she said, "but you figured out how to stop doing it, and I needed you to know." She stopped, steadied herself. "I needed you to know that I think you were right to stop." Darnell didn't respond right away. He looked out the window at the tree, at the backyard where he had done his homework on summer evenings and learned to ride a bike on the narrow strip of concrete along the fence and come home to after every hard thing the world had handed him. "You taught me everything that mattered," he said. "The quiet was just one lesson. You taught me the other things too. How to build, how to keep going, how to make something real out of nothing." Eleanor said nothing. "That's what I'm still doing," he said. Just louder now. Something in his yadars shifted. Not quite a smile. Something that lived in the neighborhood as a smile, quieter and more durable. She picked up her tea. "Good," she said, and that was enough. They sat there a while longer. Two people at a kitchen table that had held 1,000 conversations between them. The tree outside beginning, almost imperceptibly, to decide about spring. Darnell drove back to Montclair that evening. Daisy was home. She had dinner waiting. Nothing elaborate, just the kind of meal that said, "I knew you'd need something real when you got back." She looked at his face when he came through the door and didn't ask how it went. She already knew. They ate together and talked about ordinary things, and afterward sat on the back porch for a while, even though it was still cold and neither of them suggested going inside. That was its own kind of conversation. The kind that doesn't need words, because the words have already been said, and what's left is just the two of you on a porch in March, having gotten through something and being on the other side of it together.